Good morning, my friends. How's everybody doing? It is Tuesday. It is the 7th of April. For those of you who are wanting to keep track of these things, the dog is the dog is trying to move over to my lap. You can't see her, but she is. Honey, you can't be on Mama's lap. Here, I'm going to put her behind me. She'll be a lot happier. Okay. All right, we're getting some eyes here. Good morning, all. I hope you had a good night. The sun finally came out here yesterday, and I got to go out for a walk, and it just did me a world of good. I know everybody can. There are some people who just simply cannot go outside, but if you can, man, get outside and get a little walk in nature. It will do so much for your mental attitude. It certainly has helped mine. Today's digital resource, I heard about this, is, Catherine is here, and Kathy is here, and Faye from Lancaster, New York. Hi, and Barb Clark, good morning from Texas. Good morning to all of you. And Connie Wood says, thanks for the Easter brunch board idea. You know what? It really is a fun thing to do. So check out that post on my blog if you haven't yet. Okay. Anyway, the free digital resource for today is that between now and the 15th of May, Sirius XM Radio is going to let you listen for free. Now, I subscribe to Sirius in my car. My favorite is the Broadway channel. Big fan of the show tunes. And so I love that. But they've got all kinds of things. So I put a link there. I don't know if you have to give them a credit card or not. I don't know because I am already registered, so I didn't go through the whole thing. But I've really enjoyed the service, and you might want to give it a try. So, and hi, Kathy from Ontario, Canada. Is it getting warmer there? I hope so too. Anyway, shall we read? It's going to be I've got a long chapter today, and then another one that's sort of normal size, but the way I was looking at trying to get us finished by Friday, this is the way to do it. By the way, some of you have already been saying, oh, let's do another one. Bunnies, this has been so much fun, and I am so glad that this has been a good break for many of you in your day. But the truth is, this has taken a big chunk out of my work day. I got a book to edit. I got a novella I have to write. I have another book I need to start. So this, as much fun as it has been, this is going to be the last week. This is what I can do, and I will miss seeing you every morning, but this has been good. But I hope you understand that after this, I have to get back to work. I do. Otherwise, I won't have a new book for you, which I hope you will rush out and get when it's out. And I'll probably tell you about that at the end of all this. Anyway, today we're in a single thread. We are reading chapters 28 and 29. So let's start, shall we? Chapter 28, Abigail Burgess Wynne. Liza hardly looked at me when Evelyn brought her home. Not that I'd expected her face to suddenly light up with the sight of mine, but her muttered one-word responses to my questions about how she was and where she'd gone and how sorry I was were not encouraging. I was glad she was home and safe, but what good would it do to have her back if we were just going to fall into the same old patterns of resentment and recrimination? Completely ignoring me, she turned to Evelyn and said she was exhausted and was going to sleep for a while. Then she gave Evelyn a quick squeeze and trudged for the stairs. It had been a long night for everyone. I walked Margot and Evelyn to the door and thanked them both for all they'd done, and I really meant it. If not for them, well, I didn't even want to imagine how badly things could have turned out without their help. Of course, it still wasn't over. Liza was home, but the situation between us was far from resolved. Goodbye. I stood at the door and waved to Margot as she climbed in her little car and drove off. Thank you again. Evelyn was in the foyer, putting on her hat and gloves. Goodbye, Abigail, and don't look so worried. Everything's going to turn out just fine. How do you know that? I asked. Did you see the look on in her eyes when she came in here? She hates me. Give her some time, Abigail. She's cold and tired. Certainly that was true, but I noticed that Evelyn hadn't made any attempt to deny my assertion. It's no use, I said. The girl simply hates me, that's all. There's no point in trying to make up with her if she's never going to forgive me. I know she's a Burgess, and if there's one thing a Burgess knows how to do, it's hold a grudge. Yes, I've noticed that, Evelyn yawned. Abigail, calm down, really. Liza is exhausted. She needs some rest, and so do you. Go lie down for a while, and then after you've both had some sleep and can think more clearly, you can talk to her. Panic filled my breast. Talk to her? But how? What am I supposed to say? Evelyn sighed and tipped her head to one side, her eyes weary. She put a gloved hand on my shoulder. The truth, Abigail. Just tell her the truth. It's the only thing that ever works anyway. I tried to take Evelyn's advice and take a nap, but 2 hours later I was still sleepless under the blue and yellow grandmother's fan quilt that Evelyn had given me for Christmas. To tell the truth, Evelyn had said. But what was the truth? I'd spent so many years of my life, decades, trying not to think about the past, that I wasn't even sure now how to explain it to myself anymore, let alone Liza. Liza. The collateral damage in a war between two sisters who, once upon a time, had been inseparable. When I'd been Liza's age, more than 40 years ago, I could never have imagined that anything in the world could have come between me and my sister. Where had it all begun? With Susan? With David? No. It started before that, long before. For the first 6 years of my life, I was an only child, a situation that suited me perfectly at the time. But on a summer day in 1950, my father pulled up in front of my grandmother Alice's house in Winthrop, jumped out of the Packard and ran around the passenger side to open the door for Mother, and then took a pink flannel bundle from her arms, and my world changed forever. I ran down the walkway toward my beloved father, thrilled to see him, thinking only of him. But as I ran near, pigtails flying and arms open wide, Father got down on one knee and pulled back a corner of the pink flannel. Hey, kitten, look here. This is your new baby sister, Susan. What do you think? I thought she was the most beautiful baby in the whole world, and from that day forward, I'd have come to blows with anyone who said differently. Not that anyone would have said such a thing. Susan was, in fact, a beautiful child, and she grew up into a beautiful woman. I adored her. We adored each other. Everyone in Winthrop used to comment about it, telling my mother they'd never seen more devoted sisters, and it was true. No big sister could have been more committed to her baby sister than I was. I'd have done anything to protect her, and I did. But as we got older, the job became harder. My father was a handsome man, witty and charming, and something of a dandy. Even at home, I never saw him dressed in anything less formal than a three-piece suit and tie. He'd met my mother, at the time, at a dance. 4 weeks later, they were married. Father was a broker on Wall Street, but he insisted that Manhattan was no place to raise a family, so as soon as Mother became pregnant, Father moved her out to Winthrop to live in his family home with grandmother Alice. Father kept a little apartment in the city and came up to see his young family on weekends. That's how I grew up. And when I was younger, I thought nothing of it. While I adored my father and would have loved having him home during the week, I was very proud of the glamorous life he led in New York. My friends' fathers only worked at boring jobs in Winthrop. They and their families lived in poky little houses and drove even pokier old cars, but every 2 years, Father drove up in a brand new Packard. And even though Mother complained about having to share it with grandmother Alice, we lived in the biggest, most beautiful house in town. My friends' fathers came home every night, cranky and tired from the long workday. But every Friday night, my father would arrive from New York, bearing smiles and presents and eager to hear every little thing that had happened to us while he'd been gone. It was like Christmas every weekend. Some of my friends' parents barely spoke to each other. Their parents were about the same age as mine, but somehow they seemed decades older. Mother and Father were the handsomest couple you'd ever hope to see. Father took Mother out to supper every Saturday night. Susan and I didn't like having to stay home with grandmother Alice on those nights, but when mother floated downstairs, smelling of White Shoulders cologne and wearing the new dress father had bought for her at Bergdorf's, and took father's arm as he escorted her out the door, I was entranced. When I grew up, I planned on marrying a man just like my father. We were the happiest family in town. I believed that for a long time. I can't remember when I first heard the embarrassing rumors about my father and what he did all week in town, or the angry hissed conversations between mother and father that abruptly stopped whenever I'd enter the room, or began noticing the red rims around mother's eyes on those increasingly frequent Friday afternoons when father would telephone and say he was swamped with work and couldn't come home that weekend. The only thing I know for certain is that as the years passed, my beautiful and bright princess of a mother became a bitter and complaining nag. The second father came in the door, she would start in, quizzing him about what he'd done all week, complaining about how he neglected us, demanding an explanation of how he spent the hours away from her. After a few minutes, father would start to shout at her, saying that nothing he ever did was enough and he didn't know why he bothered to come home at all. Sometimes he would become so angry that he would get in the car, drive back to the city, and not return to Winthrop for weeks at a time. I blamed my mother. It was her complaining and criticism that was keeping father away. That's what I believed. And that's what I told Susan, that father was a good man, a wonderful man, and that if we wanted him to come home, we had to be very good too and never complain. Father worked very hard all week on Wall Street, I told her. When he did come home, we mustn't make him feel badly or ask him questions about why he hadn't come sooner. We mustn't bother him by asking questions about the nasty things children whispered at school. None of it was true. Those other children were just jealous of our fine house and our pretty cars and our handsome parents. We shouldn't bother father with such things. If we did, he might turn around and leave again. No one wants to be around someone who's sad or complaining, Susan. People like to be around people who are happy, I instructed my 6-year-old sister. Even if you feel sad inside, just smile and tell father how happy you are to see him. Then he'll want to stay here with us. I learned at a very young age to keep my true thoughts and feelings to myself. When I was 15 and Susan was 9, father had a heart attack and died. In the aftermath of his death and the financial ruin that followed, I had to face the truth about my family. My father had been leading a double life for years, keeping his family tucked up in a corner of rural Connecticut, playing a happy family on the weekends while, during the week in Manhattan, he led the life of a playboy bachelor, carrying on with a number of women, spending lavishly in pursuit of them, and, when he ran out of his own money, borrowing more to maintain his sumptuous lifestyle. He died penniless and in debt. For the first time in her life, mother had to work outside the home. She got a receptionist position that paid enough to cover our basic expenses, but barely. Thank heaven our home in Winthrop was owned by grandmother Alice. She died shortly after father and left the house to mother. If not for that, we'd probably have been put out on the street. Truthfully, I don't know when father's dalliances began. Perhaps my parents' marriage had been a sham from the first. But at the time, I continued to lay the blame for the disintegration of our family at mother's feet. No matter what he had done, father was my hero. I was certain that, in the beginning at least, we were that perfect family of my memory, and that my mother's suspicious and complaining nature was the cause of all our problems. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. I don't know. But one thing I do know for sure, after father died and left us penniless and everyone in town knew why, mother's negative nature became worse, and she lived the rest of her life as an embittered, angry woman. I hated being around her, and I promised myself that no matter what, I would never be like my mother. Eventually, I just couldn't bear living at home anymore, enduring mother's daily barrage of acrimony and resentment. I applied to New York University and was admitted on a scholarship and escaped to the city. I felt guilty about leaving Susan, but came home to see her nearly every weekend, neatly stepping into father's old schedule. Manhattan was like a breath of fresh air after life in Winthrop. I felt so alive and independent in the city, so completely free. It was the early 60s, and a good part of the nation, especially the younger part, was likewise throwing off the perceived shackles of their parents' expectations. Freedom was the mantra of the decade. Free speech, free living, free love. To a girl recently arrived from rural New England, it was an exhilarating time to be alive. Not too long after moving into the tiny apartment I shared with my 3 other friends, I met David Collier. David was 6 years my senior, a sculptor. I fell in love with him almost immediately. With his deep brown eyes and broad shoulders, David looked a lot like my father, but he wasn't quite like anyone I'd ever met. He was free-spirited, expressive, always so happy and carefree. I adored him. When he asked if I wanted to move in with him, I threw my arms around him and nearly smothered him with kisses. "Whoa," he said with a laugh. "I guess that must be a yes." "Oh, yes, yes, David. Can we bring my things over tonight?" He nodded. "Sure, if that's what you want, Abby. But listen," he said, his laughing eyes growing more serious for a moment. "You need to understand something. I love you, Abby. You make me so happy. There's no one I'd rather be with than you. But I don't plan on ever getting married. I don't believe in it. Marriage is just a lot of bull invented by society and religions, just one more way they try to control us. A piece of paper couldn't make me love you any more than I do right now. Besides, it wouldn't be fair to ask you to be pinned down to just one man." The smile returned to his face. "I mean, you might wake up one day and decide you couldn't stand me anymore." "Oh, no, David, that would never, ever happen. I'll love you until the day I die." David nodded. "I feel the same way, Abby, but still, you have to understand. I'm never going to get married." "Yes, David, I understand," I said, and kissed him again. But deep in my heart, I didn't suppose he really meant it. I was sure that once he saw how much I loved him, how happy I made him, he'd surely change his mind. It might take a while, but that was all right. All that mattered to me was that all that mattered to me at that moment was David. I needed him and would have agreed to anything he proposed just to keep him near. For almost 4 years, we lived together in David's artist's loft, behaving as a man and wife in every sense except legally. I went to class during the day while David worked in his studio, then scurried home in the evenings to make our dinner. At night, we'd go to poetry readings in the village, or take walks in the park, or meet up with some of David's artist friends. On Friday nights, we'd drive David's beat-up station wagon to Connecticut and spend the weekend with Mother and Susan. Susan was crazy about David. She used to watch at the window waiting for our arrival, just like I had waited for Father when I was a little girl. Then she'd run out the front door to greet us. Mother liked him too. Even when she was in one of her moods, David was always able to get a smile out of her. Of course, I never told Mother that David and I were living together, but I'm sure she suspected. One Sunday morning, while David and Susan were out in the garden picking strawberries for our breakfast, Mother, clearly embarrassed, tried to talk to me about the, quote, facts of life. I laughed and assured her it wasn't necessary, that I knew all I needed to know in that regard. Mother looked relieved, and that was the end of that. But perhaps I should have let her give me that talk after all. Near the end of my senior year at NYU, I discovered that I was pregnant. I was terrified. When I finally worked up the courage to tell David, I dissolved into tears and begged him not to leave me. At first he looked stunned, but he quickly recovered and crossed the room to take me into his arms. "It's all right, Abby. Don't worry, baby. Everything will be all right." I began sobbing even harder, this time with relief. Everything was going to be all right. David wasn't angry. I was pregnant, and he was telling me it was all right. For a moment, the terror in my breast gave way to elation. I was going to have David's baby. But my joy was short-lived. "Don't worry," David whispered into my hair as he held me. "It'll be all right. I've got a friend who knows a doctor who can take care of it. No one will ever have to know. Everything will be fine. I'll be right beside you the whole time." And I did it. Even though I wanted my baby, even though that I knew that it was wrong, I did what David wanted because I couldn't bear the idea of living without David, and I knew that if I had the baby, he would leave me. So I did it. Late at night, after business hours, David drove me to the doctor's office, and I walked up the stairs to a cold white examining room and had an illegal abortion. I'd never told anyone about this before. Don't ask me why I did it. I have no good answer for that. I will not try to make excuses for what I did because it was inexcusable. Only know that however harshly you may judge me, it cannot be as harshly as I judge myself. I have regretted it every day of my life. That night, David supported me as, weak and in terrible pain, I slowly climbed back down the stairs. He helped me into the station wagon and took me home. The doctor said I would be fine in a day or two, but it took much longer for my body to heal. I was never again able to get pregnant. Healing my spirits took even longer. For weeks that stretched into months, I felt sad and depressed. Sometimes I would start to cry for no reason at all. But of course I hid all this from David. As I knew only too well, there were two things he would not tolerate: self-pity and commitment. So I made sure not to bother him with either. After all that had happened, I still couldn't bear the thought of losing him. But in the end, none of that mattered. One day, David came home and said he'd received a grant to study sculpture in Rome. At first, I was excited, thinking he meant to bring me with him, but before long I realized that he was going alone. He said that the grant was a small one, not enough to support us both, and that Rome was expensive. The place he was going to live, he said, was small and filthy, and I would hate it. I told him I didn't care, that I would get a job to help with expenses, but he wouldn't be swayed. He was going to Rome alone. It's just for a year, baby. Then I'll be back. Why don't you move out to Connecticut with your mother and Susan for a while? You know how much Susan misses you. Think how great it would be for you to be able to spend some time with her, especially now. She'll be off to college soon, and you'll never have another chance like this. He leaned over and kissed me on the forehead. It'll be great. A year will fly by so fast, you won't believe it. This is my big break. This will make my reputation, and I'll finally be able to make a decent living as an artist. When I get back, I'll come out to Connecticut and we can talk about our future. And of course I wanted to believe him and knew that if I complained, he'd never come back. So I did what he wanted me to. 3 weeks later, we loaded the station wagon with the last of my things from our now empty loft, and David drove me to Winthrop. He left the car for me, so after we unpacked it, I drove him to the train station so he could go back to New York and catch a cab to the airport. Traffic was terrible. When we arrived at the station, the train was getting ready to leave. David had to run and left without kissing me goodbye. It would be 2 years before I saw him again. Other than the pleasure of being reunited with my little sister, living at home was just as bad as I thought it would be. Mother was as impossible as ever, disapproving of everything and everyone. She was particularly vocal in her criticism of me, frequently decrying my stupidity at letting David leave the country without extracting a ring from him and making a lot of speeches about not buying cows when milk was free. How could you be so foolish, letting him just dump you off on my doorstep and then breezing off to Europe? And what are you supposed to do now? You're a beautiful girl, Abigail, but you're nearly 23 years old. Beauty is fleeting. Believe me, I know what I'm talking about, she said bitterly. The second the flower begins to fade, they're off to greener pastures. I don't care what these women's libbers say. It's still a man's world. Marriage is the only protection a woman has. What if he doesn't come back? He is coming back. I've told you that 1,000 times. Mother smirked. So you say, but what if he doesn't? I hope you don't expect me to support you because I can't do it. Slaving away day after day in that office for a measly $320 a month, she muttered. When I think about your father and all the thousands he frittered away on cheap floozies, leaving us all with a single... Stop it, Mother. I don't want to hear it anymore. And I don't expect you to support me. I'm going to get a job. And I did. I'd graduated from NYU with a BA in humanities and a minor in art history, which was perfect for the life I had planned on living in Manhattan, running a gallery filled with David's sculptures. However, in Winthrop, the job market for someone with my education was non-existent. Not that it was much better anywhere in Connecticut. Still, I decided to try my luck in New Bern, and that day at least, I was lucky. Resume in hand and wearing the darling Mary Quant dress, a black sleeveless bodice with white pleated skirt and stand-up collar that David bought me as a going-away present, or perhaps was intended as more of a consolation prize, I marched into the New Bern Art Museum to ask for a job. As luck would have it, there was a Board of Trustees meeting going on that day. 43-year-old Wolcott Wynne III was on the board. He saw me come in, pulled the museum director aside, and next thing I knew, I had a new job and a new admirer. Wooly asked me out to dinner that day, and when I refused, came back to the museum every day for nearly 3 weeks to make the same invitation. Eventually, I relented. Wooly was a nice man, if a little arrogant, good-looking, athletic, and very persistent. He took me to expensive dinners, the theater, sent flowers, brought me gifts, and almost from the first made his intentions very clear. He wanted to make me his wife. I liked Wooly. He was fun to be with, and I was happy to have him squire me about, but I knew that I could never love him. My heart still belonged to David. I told Wooly so, but that didn't seem to discourage him. Every time I told him that David was coming back, he'd just nod slowly and make this, well, we'll see face. It was very irritating. David wrote regularly at first, and then with less frequency. Sometimes, when weeks had gone by with no word from him, I'd get angry and tell myself that I was going to end it and move on with my life. But about the time I did, a letter would arrive, full of apologies, explanations, and the endearments I longed to hear. And I would forgive him, yet again. As the end of his year of study approached, David wrote and told me that he had been asked to stay on at the studio for a second year and that it was too good an opportunity to pass up. I tore his letter and sat down to write one of my own, telling David exactly what I thought of him and his broken promises. But then I lost my nerve. I threw the letter away and wrote another, saying I was happy for him and not to worry about me. For spite, I threw in a couple of lines about my new friend, Wooly, and what a good time we'd had when he had taken me into the city to see George Fair at the Café Carlyle. I hoped that hearing about my adventures with Wooly, a wealthy, powerful man who took me to elegant places David could never dream of affording, would make him jealous, and he would change his mind and come home, but it didn't work. He just wrote back, saying he was glad that I wasn't too lonely. And as all this was going on, Wooly kept pursuing me. One Saturday morning, just a couple of weeks before David was due to return, Wooly showed up on our doorstep with 3 dozen yellow roses and a 3-carat diamond engagement ring. Right in front of Mother and Susan, he got down on his knees and proposed again, and again I turned him down. I was really angry with him for pulling that particular stunt. He knew that the minute he left, Mother would be all over me, pressuring me to reconsider. "Abigail, have you lost your mind?" she screamed. "You're going to give up the chance of a lifetime on the barest hope that this time David won't run off and leave you whenever he gets a whim? You can't trust that man, Abby. I know what I'm talking about. You can't trust anyone in this world. Even the people who say they love you will let you down. But security, social position, money in the bank, those are things no one can take from you. Mother, I don't love Wooly Wynne, and I'm not going to marry him." "Love," she snarled. "What did that ever get anyone besides a broken heart? You must be the stupidest, most selfish girl on the face of God's earth. Have you ever considered what it would mean to me or your sister if you accepted Wooly? Forget me and the fact that I've been working my fingers to the bone to support this family for years. Think of what it could mean for Susan. She could go to a good college, have a chance at life. But no, all you could think about is yourself and that good-for-nothing David." She threw up her hands in disgust. "Listen to me, Abigail. Save yourself some heartache. David doesn't love you. If he did, he'd have asked you to marry him a long time ago." That might have been the one and only intelligent thing my mother ever said to me, but it didn't matter. All I cared about was that David was coming home, and somehow, when he did, I was sure that everything would be all right. And for a while it was.
David returned to the States in June, just in time to attend Susan's high school graduation. He didn't have a dime left of his grant money, so I begged Mother to let him stay with us for a while until I could save up enough money at my museum job so we could get an apartment in the city. Mother agreed, but reluctantly. Though in the old days before she'd turned on him, Mother had been happy to let David stay in the guest room, she now insisted that he had to sleep in the garden shed. I won't have the two of you cavorting around the house doing God knows what in front of your sister, Mother said. I don't want Susan getting any crazy ideas into her head, not like you did, she said, giving me a look meant to convey her complete disappointment in me. I was ready to lash into her, but David cut in before I could say anything. He thanked her profusely and proposed that he spend the summer painting the house for her by way of repaying Mother for her kindness. Mother accepted his offer. The house was in desperate need of painting, but I could see she wasn't won over. One day in July, a thunderstorm blew out the power of the museum and we closed early. I went right home, thinking it would be nice to have dinner ready when Mother got home from work, hoping that would put her in a better mood. I ran into the house, dripping wet from the rain, and called for Susan, but she didn't answer. I supposed she'd gone to a friend's house. Thinking what luck it was that David and I were home alone a good 3 hours before Mother was due, I grabbed a bottle of wine and 2 glasses from the refrigerator and ran out to the garden shed to find David. He was already undressed, lying in the narrow iron bedstead that he and I had found in the attic and repainted. And Susan was with him. There were tears and scenes and dramas that I don't care to replay anymore. What's the point? At the end of it, I drove away in David's decrepit station wagon, found Wooly at his office, and told him that I did not love him, and I didn't expect I ever would, but that if he still wanted me, I would marry him. 2 weeks later, I did. Wooly wanted a church wedding, but at my insistence, we eloped to Reno. I wanted to be married in private, without my family. I never slept another night at our house in Winthrop. When I saw my mother, I would meet her somewhere else because I didn't want to be reminded of what had happened there. Over my mother's protests, Susan moved in with David, just as I had. I suppose she loved him, just as I had. Poor thing. She deserved my pity far more than my wrath, but I couldn't see that at the time. I didn't see or speak to Susan for the next 17 years, not until Mother died. David, thank heaven, had had the good taste to stay away from the funeral, but Susan came. It was awkward, but we were civil to one another, and oddly, in spite of all that had gone on before, it was almost a relief to see her again. But I was worried about her. She was only 34, but she looked old and tired. I kept thinking about her. A month later, I worked up the nerve to call her on the telephone with the excuse of telling her that Mother had left her a small bequest and asking her where I should have the money wired. In truth, there was no bequest. At the funeral, I had noticed Susan's worn-out shoes and threadbare coat. I guessed that David wasn't doing any better job of providing for my sister than he had for me. When I called to tell her about the check, her tearful reaction of gratitude confirmed my suspicions. Susan was desperately in need of money. I wasn't entirely ready to forgive her, but I couldn't bear the idea of her being hungry or out on the street because she didn't have enough money to pay the rent. After that, Susan and I talked on the telephone on 3 occasions, and each time it was a little less awkward. I believed that giving time, we would have eventually reconciled, but then something happened. Susan and David lived together for 17 years. Then, just as I had, Susan became pregnant. But, unlike me, she refused to abort her baby, and when she refused, David walked out. After that, I never spoke to her again. You see, in the end, it wasn't a man or her betrayal that came between us. It was me. My shame, my pride, my terrible envy. Eventually, I would have forgiven her for taking David away from me, but I could never forgive her for finding the courage to do that I had lacked, and in doing so, getting the one thing that I so longed for, the thing that all of Wooly's millions could not buy for me, real love. And that's what you were to her, I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady and failing. You were the love of her life. I envied her so. It seemed that everything I wanted in life Susan had taken from me. I see now that it wasn't true. I made my own choices, if only by refusing to choose or to stand up and say no when I had the chance. There is so much that I would do differently if only I tried to stop and steady myself, but it was no good. I could not stem the tide of tears. If only I had realized it sooner, everything could have been so different for all of us. I'm sorry. Dear God, Liza, I am so, so sorry. It's all my fault. I know you can never forgive me. It's my fault. While I had talked, Liza sat small and silent in one of the big wingback chairs that flanked the library fireplace. As she listened, she seemed to shrink into herself, drawing her arms closer into her body, curving her back into the chair cushions, as if trying to put as much physical distance between us as possible. Silent tears streamed down her cheeks as she heard for the first time the sad and secret tale of her own ancestry. Now she got up from the chair and walked across the room to the sofa where I was sitting, weeping. I felt a tentative touch on my shoulder and heard Liza's hoarse voice. I have to, Aunt Abigail. I don't want to forgive any of you. Not you or Mom or that lying scuzzball that fathered me either, but somehow I have to. We already know how things will turn out if I don't. This has been going on for too long, through too many generations of this family. I don't want to live like this anymore. I've got to forgive you, Aunt Abigail. I do. You forgive me too, okay? We're all we have left. That's chapter 28. I remember writing that chapter. It was very, very difficult, and it took me very many days. But if you're a writer and you're crying while you write, you know that something good and real is happening. And that's what happened when I wrote chapter 28. Shall we go on to chapter 29? Are you ready? Okay, let's do it. Chapter 29, Evelyn Dixon. Mom? Garrett's face looked anxious as he leaned over me. Mom, how are you feeling? Great. It was a lie. Everything hurt. My head, my arms, the flattened expanse on my chest, the place where my breasts used to be. Honey, could you get me some water? I'm so thirsty. Sure. He took the plastic cup from the nightstand and went to the sink to refill it. Your lips are all chapped. Blinking, I opened my eyes and saw Margot, flanked by Abigail, Liza, and Charlie. Margot dug into her handbag, pulled out a tube of lip balm, and used a finger to rub the balm on my cracked lips. There, I bet that feels better. I nodded and took a sip from the straw Garrett held to my lips. The water tasted good. The doctor was here a little while ago, Garrett said, but you were still asleep. She said everything was fine. She has to wait for the final lab reports, but she thinks she got everything this time. I looked down at my flat chest. Well, that's good. If she has to go in again, I'll be the only woman I know who has to buy breasts in AAA inverted. I tried to smile, but it wasn't easy. As much as I had tried to prepare myself for this moment, for waking up and seeing myself without breasts for the first time, it was still a shock. I felt like I had fallen asleep and woken up to find myself inhabiting a different body. My shape, my weight, the very mass and volume of my being had changed. I didn't recognize myself anymore. I was trying my best to put up a brave front, but it was too hard. Everything was too painful. A tear rolled down my cheek. Look at me, I whispered. What did they do to me? Garrett swallowed hard and squeezed my hand. He didn't know how to answer me. Abigail came to his rescue. She moved to the side of the bed and leaned down toward me. It's all right, Evelyn. Everything's going to be all right soon. You're tired, dear, and you're hurting. It's all right to cry. Liza nodded and her eyes were solemn. Yeah, Abigail's right. You can cry if you want to. She took my other hand and held it tenderly. Just remember that it's all going to be worth it. You're going to get well. After all, she said, we've got a deal. Liza smiled at me, then looked up and smiled at Garrett, who was standing on the opposite side of the bed, still holding my other hand. Well, in that case, Charlie said, trying hard to sound cheery, which was what we were all trying to do, trying to sound pleasant and ordinary, as if we were actors carefully repeating lines in an overrehearsed, overwritten script. It wasn't their fault. This is what people do when they're faced with an awkward situation. They try to pretend that everything is perfectly, wonderfully normal, which of course makes everything more awkward and abnormal than it was in the first place. I think it's time for the presents, don't you? Everyone murmured agreement. Charlie went over to the windowsill, opened up a giant shopping bag that was sitting on the ledge, and pulled out a white bakery box. These are my famous butterscotch macadamia nut cookies. I made a double batch for you, so you'll have some for yourself and some for visitors. Well, what do you think I'm going to be doing while I'm in here? Having tea parties? He made a face. No, of course not. But you're going to have guests. You should have something to serve. I left off another box at the nurse's station. Bit of a bribe, he said with a wink. Just to make sure they take proper care of you. I know what a difficult patient you can be. Thank you, Charlie. That was sweet of you. He bobbed his head, uncomfortable as always in the face of praise. And I'll be bringing your meals, too, while you're here. I brought you chicken soup for your lunch, and I'll be back with poached salmon for dinner, unless you'd rather have the lamb. Charlie, you don't have to do that, really. Besides, if I eat your food for every meal, they'll have to cart me out of here in a wheelbarrow. I'm fat enough as it is. Don't be silly, he said. If anything, you're too thin. We Irish prefer our women with a little meat on their bones. Oh, he exclaimed before I could protest further. And one more thing, I almost forgot. He reached into the bottom of the shopping bag and pulled out another brown paper bag with a piece of red string tied around the neck in a bow. Didn't have time to wrap it properly, he apologized. But here, go ahead and open it. I pulled on the red string, reached inside the bag, and pulled out an enormous box of crayons. 120? I didn't even know they came in boxes that big. I love it. How'd you know? Charlie grinned broadly. And I bought you a big pad of graph paper to go with it. Thought maybe you'd want to work on a few quilt designs while you're laid up. I smiled, and this time it was genuine. Thanks, Charlie. This is perfect. You're perfect. You cook, you bake, and you know exactly the right presents to bring. You're the best friend a girl could ever hope to have, I said. Still smiling, Charlie nodded again, but there was a flash in his eyes, a look of disappointment that I didn't quite understand. But then again, it was so brief that I might have imagined it. And I brought you those, Garrett said, indicating the vase of bright Gerbera daisies that was sitting on the nightstand. Thought they'd brighten up the place a little. Thank you, sweetheart, they do. He leaned down and gave me a peck on the cheek. And this, Margot said, holding out a box wrapped in a violet-covered paper with a sage-green bow, is from the three of us. It's heavy. What is it? Open it and find out. Usually, I'm careful about how I open gifts. Not because I save the paper, but when someone goes to the trouble to wrap a package, it seems to me you ought to treat it with respect. But I was so weak, and my arms were so sore that I couldn't keep my hands from shaking. I accidentally ripped the edge of the paper. That's all right, Liza said. Just open it. Do you want some help? I nodded, and together we tore the paper off the box. Liza pulled off the lid. When she did, my hand instinctively rose to my mouth to cover my surprise. Oh, I breathed. It's lovely. Oh, girls, I don't know what to say. It's just the most beautiful quilt I've ever seen in my life. And you made it, the three of you? All three were beaming, but Abigail spoke first. It was Margot's idea, but we all worked on it together. We had a few secret circle meetings without you, but we didn't think you'd mind. No, I said, not at all. It was a beautiful quilt. Knowing how much I love strong colors, they'd chosen a palette of bright greens and vibrant pinks, with the surprising accents of a white and black fabric that enhanced the depth and richness of the colors. Such happy colors. The design was bold, using a traditional theme, hearts, but giving it a fresh, modern interpretation. The theme blocks were patchworked hearts, strip-pieced in varying shades and patterns of pink, then outlined first in spring green and then again in black fabric. There were 8 complete hearts in all, scattered over a pieced green backing in an unpredictable pattern. Most interesting of all, there were several half-heart blocks, again sprinkled around the backing at irregular intervals, some isolated and lonely, floating in a field of green, others set near but not quite next to another half-heart, slightly off-center, as if the broken halves were moving toward each other in varying stages of becoming whole again. I traced the stitching on one of the hearts with my finger. It's just so incredibly beautiful. Where'd you find the pattern? I don't think I've ever seen it before. You haven't, Margot confirmed. Liza was the designer. Isn't it gorgeous? Liza ducked her head modestly. It's just something I drew up one day, she said. You can't call me a designer, more of a doodler. Well, of course you can, Abigail said a little impatiently. You sat down, thought of a theme, and then you took up your pencil and created a design that expressed what you were trying to say. That's what a designer does. Don't be silly. There's nothing that irritates me as much as false humility. Liza turned slightly and made a face. Whatever, she said with a shrug. Anyway, I was thinking about us, you know, and about our quilting circle and what it is that we all have in common. That's how I came up with the idea. In one way or another, we've all had our hearts broken, but at the same time, we've helped each other get through it. It's not like everything's better yet. We've still got problems to work through, but slowly we're helping each other to heal. You know what I mean? Yeah, I said quietly. I know what you mean. Realizing that everyone in the room, including Garrett, had been listening as she described the inspiration behind her design, Liza blushed. Well, that was the idea anyway. I decided to call it Broken Hearts Mending. I love it, I said sincerely, looking at all 3 of my friends. Besides your friendship, this is the absolutely nicest gift I have ever received. Thank you so much. There was a warm, almost burning feeling in my chest, but it wasn't caused by my incision. It was the warmth of gratitude. Liza had hit the nail on the head. We'd all had our hearts broken, but together, with each other's help and support, we were on the road to recovery, each in our own way and at our own pace. I felt truly blessed to have found such friends at the time in life when I most needed them. My poor, ravaged body was too sore for hugs, so I reached out and clasped my friend's hands. You're the best, I said. The door to my room swung open, and the nurse came in carrying the biggest, most ostentatious, and quite frankly, ugliest bouquet of flowers that I had ever seen in my life. There were 3 shades of pink carnations, at least a dozen blood-red roses, grouped in some enormous orange lilies, and then all topped off with one large, garish bird of paradise. The moment I saw it, I knew who they'd come from. I turned to Garrett. How did Mary Dell find out I was in the hospital? I told you I didn't want to worry her, not when she's getting ready to shoot her first television show. Don't blame me, he said, holding up his hands in surrender. She called and started asking questions and, well, it just sort of slipped out. Sorry. The nurse put the bouquet on the windowsill. It was so big that it blocked the light. Wow, until this minute, I never realized that flowers could be ugly. I sighed and shook my head. Howard must have been too busy to go to the florist with her, I said. She definitely picked these out herself. The nurse stood back from the flowers with her hands on her hips. Well, I've never seen anything quite like them, that's for sure. She turned to look at me. How you feeling? Do you want some more pain medication? With everybody standing there, I didn't like admitting how much I hurt, but I definitely needed something to ease it. Maybe that would be a good idea. As soon as I check your vitals and check the dressings, we'll get you another pill. Then maybe you can get some sleep, all right? I nodded gratefully. I was so tired. The nurse smiled sympathetically and then addressed the groups. Folks, I'm afraid I'm going to shoo you out of here for a while. Miss Dixon needs to rest right now. Charlie clapped his hands together like a teacher trying to get the attention of a group of unruly fourth graders. All right, gang, you heard Nurse Ratched. Clear out. The nurse shot him a look, but he gave her a wink. Now, don't be like that. I'm the one who baked all those delicious cookies and left them at the nurse's station. Trying to bribe the hospital staff? She asked. Absolutely. It's working, she deadpanned. Now take your own advice. Clear out and let this lady get some rest. She turned to me again. Is he always like this? Yes. Gee, that's too bad. Well, at least he can bake. Charlie grinned and started shooing everybody out the door. They all filed by the bed to say a quick goodbye. Come on, let's go. Come on over to the grill and I'll buy you all lunch. Garrett was the last to leave. Bye, Mom. I'll come back tonight. Think you'll feel up to having a visitor by then? You look a little tired. I'm sure I'll be fine after I get a few hours rest, I assured him. It was so good to have everybody here, especially you, sweetheart. But I really do need to get some sleep now. I didn't realize having visitors could be so exhausting. It's all right, Mom. Don't worry. Just rest, and I'll be back later. I love you. I love you too, Garrett. Garrett walked toward the door while the nurse put a blood pressure cuff on my arm. I closed my eyes, suddenly feeling completely drained. I heard the door swing open as Garrett started to leave, and then the whisper of a familiar but unexpected voice. Hey, Garrett, how's your mom? Is she asleep? Dad, what are you doing here? My eyes flew open. Rob stood at the foot of my bed, holding a dozen red roses. The thick plottins. You know, my darlings, as I read this, I realized, because I just read these on the fly, so I don't really read them ahead of time before I read them to you, and I haven't read this book for a while. You might want to know that if you went to mariebostwick.com, there's a section, a little thing on the menu that says goodies, and there's a section with recipes and a section with quilt patterns. And there you will be able to find the recipe for Charlie's famous butterscotch macadamia nut cookies, which are delicious. And I made that recipe up myself. I was rather proud of myself for that one. And you will also find a pattern for the Broken Hearts Mending Quilt. You can see a picture and you can download the pattern for free. And that was the first quilt pattern I ever offered that went with one of my books. And in fact, I think we have now, that particular pattern was designed by a friend of mine, Chris Boersma Smith, who's a wonderful art quilter. And the later patterns were designed by my very good friend, Deb Tucker. So I think there's, I don't know, 6, 7, maybe 8 patterns up there, maybe more at this point, that you can download for free. Just go to mariebostwick.com and look for the goodies tab. And then on the pull down menu, you'll see a thing that says recipes and quilts, and you can download those for free. So that's always been my gift to my readers with the various books. All right, word chime's just about up. But I wanted to tell you about the verse that I was thinking about this morning. If I can now find it. Where did I do? I should have marked this a little better. Yes, it is. There it is. This was, I thought, really pretty wonderful for the Easter season, which is coming up on Easter Sunday. So this is from 1 Corinthians chapter 5. This is verse 7b and verse 8. For indeed Christ our Passover was sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. My friends, I will see you here tomorrow. I hope you have an absolutely glorious, wonderful, beautiful Tuesday. See you on Wednesday.